Long before nations and borders existed, a great civilization quietly flourished along the banks of a river that would shape history. The Indus, located in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. This land was home to one of humanity's earliest urban experiments, the Indus River and its tributaries, including the ancient Ghaggar Hakra, brought life to a vast and varied landscape. These were not just simple river banks. The region stretched from misty Himalayan foothills to wind-swept deserts, from fertile floodplains to the edges of the Arabian Sea. It was a geography of extremes, and it demanded innovation. In the north, snowmelt from the mountains fed rich, alluvial soil, ideal for early agriculture. In the south, dry zones tested the resilience of its people. Along the coast, ancient mariners set out on early voyages, connecting this civilization to distant cultures. The people of the Indus chose their settlements wisely. They built near rivers for water, near forests for resources, and near trade routes for connection. Nature wasn't just a backdrop, it was a partner in their survival and growth. Here, in the cradle of contrasting environments, a civilization would rise that mastered the land, not by conquering it, but by living in harmony with it. This is the geographic heartbeat of the Indus Valley Civilization, where nature's diversity became humanity's opportunity. In the embrace of these rich and varied lands, human innovation began to take root. By around 3300 BCE, this landscape gave rise to more than just scattered villages. It became the cradle of a full-fledged civilization, known today as the Indus Valley Civilization. It stood among the earliest of the Bronze Age, flourishing alongside the likes of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But this civilization didn't appear overnight. Its roots stretched back to farming communities like Mehrgarh, one of the oldest agricultural settlements in South Asia. Here, nearly 1,000 years before the rise of cities, people were already domesticating animals, storing grain, and crafting tools from stone and copper. Slowly, over generations, these early villages grew in size, complexity, and ambition. Mud huts gave way to brick dwellings, communal wells and granaries emerged. With each innovation, the seeds of urban life took deeper hold. The fertile floodplains and dependable monsoons supported surplus farming, freeing some people to become artisans, builders, and traders. Villages began to specialize and to connect, forming a network that laid the foundation for vast urban centers. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, the transformation was complete. Rural life had evolved into organized city-states, the first signs of a sophisticated civilization taking shape across the valley. From the quiet rhythm of farming in Mehrgarh to the early bustle of city life, the people of the Indus Valley were writing a new chapter in human history, one where time, land, and innovation worked in harmony. As these early settlements took shape, the land itself became their greatest ally. The Indus Valley was more than just fertile, it was resource-rich. With access to dependable rivers, the people tapped into a steady supply of fresh water. Seasonal floods deposited nutrient-rich silt, creating farmland that could sustain large populations year after year. Beneath the surface, clay deposits were plentiful, ideal for molding bricks, pottery, and everyday tools. This seemingly simple material would become the building block of Indus cities, shaping homes, streets, and even complex drainage systems. To the west, the hills and mountains offered something even more valuable: Raw materials for industry, copper, veins and semi-precious stones like carnelian, agate, and lapis lazuli were extracted and carried down into the valley. These materials fed a growing artisan class and helped fuel long-distance trade. Meanwhile, the forests and rivers supported diverse livelihoods. Hunting, fishing, and foraging provided food security and material goods, from hides and bones to reeds and timber. The civilization's connection to its natural environment was deeply practical, not just spiritual or symbolic. Every resource was used with precision and purpose, often in ways that showed a remarkable understanding of balance and sustainability. In the Indus Valley, nature didn't merely surround the people, it shaped their lives, their cities, and their future. But even the richest land depends on a delicate balance. And in the Indus Valley, that balance was written in the skies. Long ago, this region was more humid, more generous. Each year, monsoon winds swept in from the Indian Ocean, bringing life-giving rain to the fields, forests, and rivers. These rains flooded the Indus and its tributaries, not with chaos, but with nourishment. The floods deposited layers of fertile silt, rejuvenating the soil and ensuring thriving harvests year after year. This seasonal rhythm became the heartbeat of the civilization. People timed their planting, their building, and their rituals around the sky. The floods fed the land fed the people, and the people responded with remarkable adaptations. Elevated buildings, intricate drainage, and water storage systems built to work with nature, not against it. But over time, that rhythm began to break. The monsoons grew erratic. Rivers like the Ghaggar began to dry. What was once predictable became unreliable. Crops began to fail. Wells dropped lower. Villages slowly emptied. There were no great wars, no invaders sweeping through. Instead, there was a quiet unraveling, hidden in the soil and the skies. In the end, it may not have been an enemy that brought the Indus cities to their knees, but the absence of rain, and a slow, silent shift in the winds they once trusted. But before the skies grew uncertain, the land below had blossomed, and at the heart of it all was farming. The people of the Indus Valley were not just city builders. They were cultivators of life. From the earliest days, they learned to read the land and coax it into abundance. Fields of wheat and barley rippled in the monsoon breeze. Millet and cotton grew in carefully tended plots, fed by floodwaters and simple irrigation channels carved by hand. This wasn't industrial farming. It was farming in rhythm with the seasons. Crops were chosen not just for yield, but for resilience. And while the rivers gave water, it was human ingenuity that directed it. Early farmers dug canals, shaped embankments, and stored water in the stone-lined reservoirs, ensuring that even in dry spells, their crops had a fighting chance. Beside them, domesticated animals formed the backbone of agricultural life. Cattle pulled wooden plows through the earth. Goats and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. Chickens clucked between mud brick pens. The farm was not just a place of food, it was a web of interdependence. Animals and people working side by side. Together, these early agricultural practices laid the groundwork for everything that followed: cities, trade, and culture. The roots of civilization, quite literally, began in the soil. And where there were fields, there were homes. Small clusters of life began to take shape. The earliest settlements of the Indus Valley, these weren't cities yet, but they were more than camps. Along riverbanks and fertile floodplains, communities chose their land wisely, always near water, and often along natural trade routes that would one day stretch to distant regions. Their homes began modestly, made of sun-dried mud bricks, simple and practical. Over time, as villages grew, these evolved into fired brick structures, more durable, more permanent, and carefully planned. Even in these early phases, there was structure. Homes stood in rows. Storage pits were dug to protect grain. Hearths were placed centrally for warmth and cooking. In larger villages, grain silos stood like silent sentinels, holding the harvest for future seasons. These weren't just homes, they were systems, and around them, life took root. Children playing, livestock grazing, artisans working with clay and stone. The sounds of a growing civilization echo quietly from these foundations. Though smaller than the grand cities to come, these early settlements reveal a people already thinking collectively, already laying bricks not just for shelter, but for society. In their simplicity, they carried the DNA of something far greater. The village was not the beginning of life, it was the beginning of civilization. And civilization, by nature, reaches outward, it listens, it trades, it learns, it connects. The Indus Valley was never isolated. From its earliest days, it was a crossroads, a living thread between diverse regions and peoples. To the west, it touched Balochistan. To the southeast, it traded with Gujarat. And to the north, its influence crept into the highlands of Afghanistan. Paths worn by feet and carts became the arteries of exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas. Symbols, etched onto pottery in distant lands, match those found in Indus settlements. Tools and ornaments crafted in one region appear in another. A shared language of form and function seems to ripple across hundreds of miles. The quiet signature of cultural diffusion. There was no single empire, no conquering army. Instead, there was a rhythm of contact, mutual influence, not dominance. Artisans in faraway regions mimicked Indus beadwork. Stone weights found in Balochistan were carved to Indus standards. Terracotta figurines carried familiar forms. The spread wasn't forced, it was organic, the natural result of contact between neighbors with something to share. Even as the Indus cities were rising, they were also reaching, forming relationships that helped define the greater Bronze Age world. This was not just a civilization of the Indus, it was a civilization in conversation with others, part of a much wider ancient dialogue. And then, for thousands of years, that conversation went silent, buried beneath dust, brick, and time, until the 1920s. As British engineers laid railway lines across Punjab, they began uncovering strange, uniform bricks that didn't match the known empires of India's past. What they found would rewrite the early history of South Asia. The ruins of Harappa and later Mohenjo-daro emerged from the soil like echoes. Vast cities built with grid layouts, drainage systems, and public infrastructure, crafted long before the rise of Rome or Egypt's Golden Age. These were not myth, they were fact, preserved in clay. And as excavations deepened, so did the story. Beneath the great cities lay older, earlier villages, smaller and simpler, the blueprints of urbanization itself. Artifacts found across sites helped connect the dots, weights and measures, identical pottery styles, and shared seals spread across thousands of kilometers. The diversity of the terrain, rivers, deserts, coasts, explained the diversity of the culture. The geography had shaped their unity. Even today, archaeologists are still digging, still brushing away the earth, still piecing together a civilization. Without kings, without conquest, yet with brilliance in every brick. It was once forgotten. Now, it rises again, not through conquest, but through discovery. The village was not the beginning of life. It was the beginning of civilization. But as settlements grew larger, a quiet revolution unfolded. The people of the Indus Valley began to build not just for survival, but for structure, flow, and vision. This was the age of urban design. In cities like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Dholavira, something remarkable took shape. The first known examples of large-scale, deliberate city planning. Streets were not crooked or improvised. They ran in clean, straight lines, crossing each other at near-perfect right angles. Neighborhoods fit together like puzzle pieces. Central streets were wide enough for cars. Side lanes narrowed into quiet residential alleys. It wasn't just functional, it was forward-thinking. The cities were divided, often with a raised citadel area for public or administrative buildings and a lower town for homes and workshops. This zoning suggested a deeper logic, of order, of balance, and of care. Who planned these cities? We don't know, but the results speak louder than any forgotten title or name. This was not the chaos of chance. It was the work of a people who valued coordination. In a time when most of the world's settlements were scattered and irregular, the Indus Valley stood apart, as if they had glimpsed a future the rest had yet to imagine. Their cities weren't just lived in, they were designed to be lived in. Streets and city blocks formed the skeleton of Indus cities. But the bricks, Those told a story of their own. These weren't random chunks of clay. They were standardized, purposeful, fired in kilns to last. Each brick followed near identical ratios, a consistent mold repeated across hundreds of miles. This wasn't just smart, it was revolutionary. A system of modular, uniform construction thousands of years before blueprints and rulers. The houses they built with these bricks were just as thoughtful. Thick outer walls provided insulation from the sweltering heat. Flat roofs doubled as living and sleeping spaces. Courtyards at the center brought light, air, and privacy into each home, long before modern concepts of ventilation or zoning. Some buildings even reached upward, 2 or more stories high, their staircases rising, within thick walls of clay and stone. In a world where most dwellings were still huts, this was vertical ambition. Public structures were built with the same durable logic. No frills, no excess, just strength, balance, and function. Even today, many bricks from Mohenjo-daro still hold their shape. Silent, sun-baked relics of a society that measured, molded, and mastered its material world. The cities of the Indus were just planned. They were built to endure. The walls of the Indus cities were strong, but it was behind those walls that life truly unfolded. In every block, in every quiet courtyard, the rhythm of daily living took shape. Houses varied, some large, some small, but all followed shared principles. Brick by brick, the people of the Indus designed not only for survival, but for dignity, comfort, and order. Many homes had private wells, tucked just inside the entrance or courtyard, a direct source of clean water without needing to leave the home. Toilets and bathing areas, remarkably advanced for their time, were built with sloped floors and linked to covered drains that carried waste away from the city. At the heart of most homes was a courtyard, open to the sky, quiet, shaded. It was the center of family life, a space for air and light in dense neighborhoods. These courtyards weren't just practical, they offered privacy, ventilation, and connection to nature in a planned, purposeful way. Living spaces surrounded the courtyard in a U-shape or square, forming bedrooms, kitchens, and work areas. Some homes even had separate areas for storage or guests, subtle signs of a society that valued structure and boundaries. The Indus didn't build castles or palaces, but in these modest homes, they built something more lasting, a balanced, sustainable way of life. Beyond the quiet of household courtyards, another layer of life emerged, public life. And in the cities of the Indus Valley, it was supported by remarkable infrastructure. These were not chaotic settlements, they were places of order, and that order extended into the civic heart of each city. In Mohenjo-daro, one structure towers above all in both scale and mystery, the Great Bath, built with perfectly fitted bricks and sealed with bitumen. Its massive central pool was fed by carefully channeled water and drained just as efficiently. Was it for ritual purification, public gatherings, community unity? We may never know, but its presence speaks volumes. Nearby stood assembly halls, raised platforms, and possibly storage buildings for grain. These weren't palaces or temples, they were practical, yet monumental. Signs of a civilization focused on systems, not kings. In multiple cities, archaeologists found granaries with air vents, loading bays, and platforms, early signs of centralized storage, maybe even controlled distribution. The scale and uniformity of these buildings suggest a shared vision, not just within cities, but across the entire region. The Indus Valley didn't just build homes, they built cities that served the public good, places where architecture wasn't just shelter, but structure for society itself. Beneath the quiet streets of the Indus cities, something extraordinary was flowing. Not commerce, not crowds, but water. Long before the concept of modern plumbing, the Indus Valley Civilization mastered something generations ahead of its time: urban water engineering. Beneath the brick-paved roads ran a network of covered drainage systems, channels lined with precisely laid bricks and capped with heavy stone slabs. These were not makeshift ditches, they were designed, maintained, and reliable. Wastewater from homes, bath platforms, and even monumental buildings like the Great Bath was directed into these underground systems. Some drains had inspection holes, stone traps, or settling basins to remove debris. evidence of deep technical understanding. And while wastewater was carried away, clean water was never far. Nearly every home had access to a well, either private or shared. In larger cities, wells dotted the public streets like fountains in modern plazas. Water was lifted by hand, stored in clay vessels, and carried home, a daily rhythm powered not by pipes, but by people. All of it, clean water in, wastewater out, ran through a system so advanced that some of it still works today. They didn't just manage water, they respected it. To the people of the Indus, water was not just a need. It was part of the city's design, flowing through every home, every street, and every plan. Every city tells a story, not just in its buildings, but in how those buildings are arranged, and the cities of the Indus Valley had a structure that spoke of logic, purpose, and vision. Nearly every major site, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, followed a two-part layout. At the top stood the citadel, a raised platform, fortified by massive brick walls. Here, the city's most important public structures stood: granaries, assembly halls, and perhaps places of ritual or governance. It wasn't a royal palace, and no throne room has ever been found. But this elevated zone was clearly different. It was symbolic, strategic, secure. Below the citadel stretched the lower town, the heartbeat of urban life. Homes, shops, markets, and workshops filled these carefully planned neighborhoods. In some areas, zoning was even more specific. Industrial quarters clustered near kilns, bead-making workshops, and metalworking sites. Ash deposits, slag, and rows of furnaces marked zones of intense production, evidence of urban industries at scale. This wasn't random. This was zoning with intent, separating fire from family, noise from rest, and administration from everyday life. It shows us that the Indus weren't just builders or engineers. They were organizers, creating cities that didn't just function, they flowed. A city is only as alive as its movement, and in the Indus Valley, movement was not an accident, it was designed. Streets in cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa weren't narrow, winding alleys. They were wide, straight, and deliberate, built to accommodate carts, pedestrians, and animals alike. Main roads stretched up to 10 meters across, wide enough for bullock carts loaded with grain or pottery to pass with ease. Smaller lanes branched out from them, creating a seamless flow between public spaces and residential quarters. This wasn't just convenience, it was infrastructure with intention. Along many roads, archaeologists found raised sidewalks built from fired bricks, spaces for walking, separated from car paths. In some areas, the streets themselves were slightly elevated, angled to help rainwater run into drains rather than pool in the roads. Platforms were used at intersections, where drains crossed the street or where goods were likely loaded and unloaded. Even the placement of wells and turnarounds suggests the planners understood how people and carts would flow. It all points to something remarkable. An ancient society that saw a city not just as walls and buildings, but as a living, breathing organism with arteries of motion. They planned for movement, for weather, for wear. And in doing so, they created cities not just to stand still, but to move. One city, carefully planned, is impressive. But dozens of cities, built hundreds or even thousands of kilometers apart, sharing the same structure, the same bricks, the same vision. That's something else entirely. Across the Indus region, from Mohenjo-daro in the south to Harappa in the north, from the dry lands of Rakagari to the salt flats near Dholavira, the pattern held: grid-planned streets, standardized bricks, sophisticated drainage. It didn't matter if the city was near the coast or the desert, the design principles remained. This wasn't imitation. It was integration. The uniformity hints at something deeper than trade. A shared system of measurement, shared values, perhaps even a shared authority or ideological belief that spanned an enormous territory. And all of it done without palaces, pyramids, or monuments to kings. No statues, no inscriptions glorifying rulers. Instead, the legacy was in the planning itself. In the silent harmony of streets, bricks, drains, and homes that spoke across vast distances, not in words, but in design. In an ancient world divided by empires and war, the Indus Valley stood apart, a network of cities woven not by conquest, but by coordination, a civilization of many voices that somehow still moved as one. The cities of the Indus were made of brick and mortar, but beneath them, quite literally, everything rested on the soil. Agriculture wasn't just an occupation, it was the foundation. Long before carts rolled through stone streets or craftsmen shaped beads in their workshops, there were hands in the earth, planting, tending, harvesting. The land gave generously. Wheat, barley, and millet rippled in the breeze, fed by rivers that rose with the monsoon. Cotton fields flowered white, the earliest threads of a textile tradition that would one day circle the world. It wasn't luck, it was labor and design. Floods were welcomed, channeled through carved canals. Fields were shaped with care, boundaries set with stone and memory. They didn't wait for rain, they prepared for it, and when the harvest came, they brought more than food. They brought time for some to become potters, others to become builders or traders. Because surplus meant choice. And choice, that's what makes a civilization rise. This was not a world of scarcity. It was a system, quiet, calculated, and enduring. In every sheaf of grain, in every cotton thread, was the heartbeat of the Indus economy. They didn't just grow crops, they grew possibility. The fields were green, the canals carved, but the rhythm of Indus farming beat not only in human hands, but in hoof and horn. Domesticated animals were everywhere, not just background life, but partners in the work of survival. Cattle roamed the pastures, heavy-bodied and slow, yet strong enough to pull the ancient plows through river-fed soil. Water buffalo waded through flooded fields, calm and patient, helping where carts or people could not. Goats and sheep clung to the margins, low maintenance, endlessly useful. They gave milk, meat, hides, and wool, woven into cloth or wrapped into everyday needs. Even dogs had their place, companions, herders, guardians at the edge of settlement life, and the ox, massive, deliberate, was the muscle behind the mission. Hitched to wooden carts or plows, it helped transform a subsistence life into surplus. These animals weren't trophies. They were the quiet engines of an agricultural society. Their bones were tools. Their hides became tents or sandals. Their presence made possible what hands alone could never finish. The Indus people lived not above nature, but within it. In the tread of oxen and the soft bleating of goats was a story of coexistence, etched into the mud and memory of daily life. They farmed the land, but they built their world with animals at their side. The fields fed the people, but it was the workshops that brought their world to life. Behind quiet brick walls, a different rhythm echoed, not of hooves or harvest, but of tools against stone, of beads being strung, of cloth being spun. Here, the Indus Valley revealed another face, not just farmers, but artisans. Potters turned red clay into vessels, sturdy, symmetrical, often painted with delicate black designs. Kilns glowed at the city's edge, their heat hardening the ordinary into the essential. Beadmakers worked with carnelian and agate, shaping stones into perfect, polished gems, tiny objects of trade, beauty, and meaning. Metalworkers melted copper and cast bronze, hammered gold into ornaments, and shaped tools as durable as they were elegant. Spindles turned, threads stretched, fingers moved in practiced repetition. These were not scattered crafts. Workshops clustered near homes, tools laid out with intention, a system, not a hobby. The beauty wasn't just in the objects, it was in the organization behind them. From shell bangles to bronze chisels, from glazed beads to painted jars, the artisans of the Indus left behind no written name, but they signed every piece with skill. Civilization is not just about what is built, it's about what is made, and the hands that make it. In the land where artisans shaped beads and farmers sowed grain, another layer held it all together, a hidden system of order, carved in stone. Standardization. Across a civilization that stretched for over 1,000 kilometers, from Dholavira to Harappa, the weight stayed the same. Perfectly cubical, cut from chert or limestone, small enough to fit in a palm, precise enough to build trust. These weren't random stones. Each one followed a set ratio, part of a decimal-based system. long before decimal points had names. Scales marked for measurement sat beside stalls and workshops. Merchants and traders used them not just to weigh grain or gold, but to ensure fairness, because trade without trust is chaos. And the Indus Valley did not deal in chaos. That shared calibration, across vast distances, meant something deeper, a shared system, a shared logic, perhaps even a shared authority guiding the flow of goods. They didn't leave behind scrolls or proclamations, but they left weights, dozens of them, matching from city to city like pieces of a silent code. And through that code, the people of the Indus created an economy that was not just productive, but principled. It wasn't just what they made, it was how precisely they measured it. Across the quiet lanes of the Indus cities, beneath the rooftops and courtyards, something moved. Not just people, but goods and ideas. The Indus Valley was not a collection of isolated towns. It was a network, humming with trade. City spoke to village, village spoke to river, river carried everything. Timber floated downstream from forested edges. Lapis lazuli, a vivid blue stone, made its way from distant highlands. Shells arrived from coastal shores, polished and carved deep inland by artisans who had never seen the sea. From the salt plains of Gujarat to the bustling streets of Harappa, goods moved with quiet purpose, on carts, on foot, and along the river's steady flow. And it wasn't just what they moved, but how seamlessly they did it. Same bricks, same weights, same tools, a civilization woven together, not by conquest, but by connection. At rest stops and river banks, traders exchanged not just goods, but stories, ideas, and traditions. There were no gold-throned kings to command this system, only shared habits, shared needs, and perhaps something deeper, a shared understanding. The Indus Valley did not need borders, because it had bridges, bridges of trade, trust, and movement, a civilization in motion, not loud, not written, but profoundly connected. The rivers carried goods from village to city, but some journeys went farther. Much farther. From the heat of the Indus Valley, trade routes stretched outward like veins of ambition, toward Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, Central Asia, and beyond. There were no passports, no flags, just merchants with bundles of cotton cloth, sacks of beads, and stones the color of fire and ocean. Indus cotton, among the first ever spun, was soft, strong, and prized. Carnelian beads, polished to perfection, sparkled across necks in cities far from home. In return came silver, tin, perhaps even wool from highland herders. And yet, through all this distance, Indus goods remained unmistakable, stamped with unique seals, packaged in uniform jars, measured with standard weights. They didn't just send products, they sent identity. Across deserts, across seas, Indus traders left no names, but they left fingerprints. On Mesopotamian tablets, the word Meluha appears, a name some scholars believe was theirs, a whisper of a faraway people who moved quietly, but reached far. This was not empire, it was exchange. A civilization not defined by conquest, but by connection. They built no armies to reach the world, they built trust. And in the silence of the archaeological record, it is their trade that still speaks loudest. Trade may begin with goods, but it travels by movement. And in the Indus Valley, movement was an art of its own. On dry roads and dusty plains, bullock carts creaked forward, wooden wheels turning slowly under the weight of cotton, grain, or copper. Simple, efficient, ubiquitous. On footpaths that wound between towns and villages, caravans moved with quiet rhythm, led by herders, traders, and families carrying stories as much as supplies. And then there was the river, the great highway of the ancient world. Flat cotton boats drifted downstream, guided by current and pull, laden with jars, textiles, and time. But perhaps the greatest surprise lies by the sea. At Lawful, near the Gulf of Kamhit, archaeologists uncovered a dockyard, cut from stone, drained by tide, designed for something astonishing: organized maritime trade. This was no myth. This was infrastructure, built to launch boats from land to sea. And in the cities, they left behind tiny models, terracotta carts with simple axles and painted wheels. Not toys, but echoes of daily life, proof that transportation wasn't rare, it was routine. They didn't just build cities. They built systems to move, to connect, to reach, because in the Indus Valley, movement wasn't just how goods traveled, it was how civilization flowed. In the quiet order of the Indus Valley, there was no currency, no coin, no king's image pressed into metal. Instead, there were seals. Small, carved, silent, but powerful, made from steatite, a soft stone hardened by fire. These seals were engraved with care. Their surfaces held more than decoration, they held identity. A humped bull, perfectly balanced. A tiger mid-stride, a unicorn, elegant, impossible. And always, the script, a delicate symbols flowing like whispered thought. We still cannot read it, but we can feel its purpose. Seals were likely pressed into soft clay, on jars, on bundles, on documents long lost to time. They marked ownership. They signaled origin. They spoke for the merchant who sent them. Each was both art and function, a personal stamp in a world without signatures. A barcode without technology. They were found in cities, towns, and even far-off lands, because wherever Indus goods went, the seal went with them. In these few square centimeters of stone, a civilization left its trace, not through kings, but through trade. Not through monuments, but through marks. Their economy didn't just move by weight and measure, it moved by trust, sealed with stone, and remembered in silence. The Indus didn't speak loudly, but they left their name pressed into clay. The Indus cities rose from soil and brick, shaped by hands that knew how to build, but what they built was more than walls. It was a way of life, and within that life, the lines between rich and poor are hard to find. There were no towering palaces, no carved thrones, no grand tombs filled with gold. Instead, house after house, built with the same bricks, the same plans, the same rhythm. This wasn't a world ruled by kings. It was a world ruled by balance. A merchant's home looked much like a potter's. A weaver's courtyard echoed the space of a farmer's. The cities whispered of equality, not the kind declared by law or decree, but the kind etched into every street and doorstep. Uniform housing, standard tools, no monuments to egos or word of power. If it existed, was quiet, shared, perhaps, by councils or elders, those who led without needing to rise above. Children played in alleyways that didn't care about status. Wells served every block, not just the fortunate few. Even public spaces, like the Great Bath, were meant for all. In the Indus Valley, civilization didn't mean hierarchy. It meant harmony. And in that choice, that rare, radical choice, they created a society that still leaves us wondering. Not how they built so much, but how they did it, together. They lived without kings, but not without grace. In the Indus Valley, where power was subtle and homes were equal, life still shimmered with detail. In cloth, in color, in ornament, the people wore cotton, light, breathable, hand-woven. A miracle of early agriculture spun into simple tunics, shawls, and wraps. There were no silk robes, no gilded crowns. But look closely, and you'll see beauty. Tiny figurines, carved in terracotta, show women with braided hair, combed and coiled, men with bands across their foreheads, necklaces of beads, agate, carnelian, faience, polished and precise. This was not extravagance, it was expression. An art of the everyday. Bangles lined the arms of both women and men, not as marks of rank, but of identity. Children played with painted toys while wearing amulets around their necks. Even the humble potter may have worn a shell pendant close to his heart. Adornment was not for the elite, it was for everyone, woven into the rhythm of morning chores and evening stories. And through it all, there was care. In how they dressed, how they bathed, how they combed their hair. The Indus people didn't carve empires, they carved time, into beads, into bangles, into rituals of cleanliness and calm. This was not a civilization obsessed with monuments. It was one rooted in the quiet dignity of daily life, and that may be its most lasting beauty. They dressed with care, but they also made with care. In the quiet courtyards and shaded workshops of the Indus Valley, hands moved with precision, shaping more than tools, shaping beauty. This was a culture that spoke through form. Terracotta was everywhere, not crude, Not careless, but deliberate. Figurines of women with wide hips and elaborate hair. Animals with arched backs and alert stances. Bulls, elephants, even unicorn-like creatures, not mythical, but symbolic, perhaps totemic, perhaps spiritual, their meaning still sealed behind undeciphered signs. Stone was carved into amulets and seals, each one etched with symbols and creatures, tiny but exact, as if meant to be held, or worn, or traded. Pottery, too, told quiet stories, curved with grace, painted in fine lines, balanced as if symmetry itself was sacred. Beads were polished until they caught the light. Toys had wheels and moving limbs, not just for play, but for the joy of making something that worked. This was not a world of excess, but of elegance. The Indus artisan didn't sign their work. They didn't need to. Their signature was in the balance, the form, the confidence of a people who knew that civilization is not only built with bricks, but with beauty. They carved, they painted, they shaped clay and stone into beauty, and through it all, they wrote. But not in words we understand. Across the cities of the Indus, from Harappa to Dholavira, we find the same quiet mystery. Small seals, copper plates, fragments of pottery, marked with signs. The Indus script? Roughly 400 unique symbols. Most inscriptions are short, just 4, 5, maybe 6 characters. No long sentences, no flowing text, but they repeat, across space, across time, each mark carefully etched above the image of an animal or object, a bull, a tree, a horned figure. Were these names? Titles? Trade codes? We don't know. There are no bilingual keys, no Indus to Mesopotamian translations, no alphabet we can compare, no cipher to crack, and yet, something intentional there, standardized, systematic. The same signs appear again and again, even hundreds of kilometers apart, a shared code in a civilization that left no kings, no wars, no boasting epics, just symbols. Perhaps it wasn't about storytelling. Perhaps it was about identity, or ownership, or belief. Whatever they meant, they mattered, because someone took the time to carve them in stone, and that alone is enough to make us listen, even if we still don't understand the words. They carved their symbols in silence. No epic myths, no golden shrines, and yet, there was belief, not the towering temples of other ancient worlds, but something humbler, rooted in earth and water. In the Indus Valley, the sacred did not rise high, it sank deep. Altars built of mud brick, fire pits arranged with care in quiet courtyards, a basin, a flame. A gesture. At the heart of Mohenjo-daro stood something more, the Great Bath, a monumental tank, sealed tight with bitumen, fed by stone drains and steps that led you down into stillness. It wasn't just a place to wash. It was a place to be changed, perhaps a ritual of cleansing, or a gathering place where water met spirit. The symbols they left behind speak without words. A pipal tree, sacred and sheltering, the swastika, turning in eternal balance. The mother figure, broad-hipped and watchful. Nature was not something to fear. It was something to honor. Through fertility, through fire, through flowing water. No gods have come to us from these cities, no names etched into tablets, but the faith remains, in the calm of their planning, the symmetry of their seals, the reverence with which they built for others, not just for themselves. In the Indus Valley, religion was not an institution, it was an instinct, quiet, circular, enduring. They built with symmetry, they worshipped in silence, but they also laughed. In the Indus Valley, life wasn't all work and ritual. It pulsed with moments of play, quiet joys carved in clay and time. Archaeologists found dice, tiny cubes, with dots etched by hand, balanced and worn at the corners. They fit perfectly in the palm, as if passed from hand to hand for generations. Board games, too, flat slabs with carved grids, stone counters waiting for a player's move. Were they games of strategy? Or chance? Perhaps both? Mirrors of the mind, sharpening thought while passing time. Children played with toys shaped like animals. Terracotta bulls, rams, birds with spinning heads. Some had wheels, some could roll, some moved when pulled by a string. And then, the oldest game of all, storytelling. A pot painted with a running animal, a carved seal showing a horned figure. Not just images, but imagination. They didn't leave us their songs, but they left us their toys, their games, their moments of joy, because even in a civilization without monuments or kings, people still played, still told stories, still gathered under trees to pass the hours with laughter. And in those moments, in that leisure, we find something deeply human. The Indus world was not just balanced, it was alive. They played games, they told stories, and unlike many of their ancient neighbors, they did not prepare for war. In the Indus Valley, cities rose without walls. No great fortresses, no garrisons, no armies etched into stone, across thousands of archaeological finds. Not a single battlefield, not a single mass grave. No swords, no armor, no monuments to victory or conquest. Their tools, crafted for farming, building, and trade, not battle. Stone weights, copper blades, terracotta, wheels, the gear of makers, not destroyers. Where other civilizations glorified kings and conquerors, the Indus people chose something different. Cooperation. They poured their energy into trade. Long-distance networks linking them with Mesopotamia, Iran, and Central Asia. Into crafts, beads, pottery, precision tools. Into planning, street grids, drainage, public baths. They built cities designed not to defend against one another, but to function together. What kind of society chooses stability over supremacy? What kind of people leave behind no war stories? Perhaps one that measured greatness not by conquest, but by coexistence. They may not have ruled empires, but they mastered something rarer: peace, sustained, organized, shared. And that, too, is a kind of power. They lived without kings, they didn't build empires, and yet they were connected across 1,000 kilometers, from Dholavira in the west to Harappa in the north to Lawful in the south. The Indus Valley Civilization spoke with one voice, not in language, but in pattern. The bricks, same size, same ratio. The weights, balanced to the gram. The seals, same animals, same script, same style. Pottery painted with the same motifs. Homes built with the same layouts. Cities planned with the same logic, and yet there was no capital, no central ruler, no visible chain of command. Still, they agreed. Across rivers, deserts, and plains, they agreed to build a world of order, of balance, of flow. What kind of civilization manages this kind of unity without force? Without conquest? Perhaps they were bound not by a single leader, but by shared beliefs, by values passed down not through command, but through craft, through planning, through ritual. Every seal, every wall, every well, an echo of something shared. A culture that didn't just survive, but stayed coherent. They called no one king, but they built with consensus, and maybe that is their greatest legacy. Not that they spread their culture, but that they agreed to live it together. The decline of the Indus Valley Civilization did not come with fire or conquest. There are no signs of mass destruction, no evidence of foreign invasion. Instead, beginning around 1900 BCE, the cities began to change subtly at first, then more visibly. Populations in major centers like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa started to shrink. Homes were abandoned. Streets grew quiet. Archaeological layers from this period show clear signs of urban decay. Carefully planned layouts gave way to disorder. New buildings were constructed hastily, often on top of older structures misaligned, cramped, and poorly made. Even the famous Indus bricks, once uniform and standardized across hundreds of kilometers, began to lose consistency. Craftsmanship declined. Workshops that once produced fine pottery, beads, and seals fell silent. The distinctive Indus script, once seen on seals and tablets, gradually disappeared from use. What we see is not a sudden collapse, but a long, uneven process of disintegration. Some neighborhoods were reused, others were left to crumble. Public infrastructure fell into disrepair, drainage systems clogged. Kins went cold. It appears that people began moving away from the cities, perhaps returning to rural life, or forming smaller settlements beyond the urban centers. This gradual breakdown marked the beginning of the end for one of the world's most remarkable early civilizations. a civilization that had lasted for over 700 years quietly entering its twilight. One of the key drivers of the Indus Valley's decline may have come from the skies. Climate records suggest that, around 1900 BCE, the region began to experience a major shift in monsoon patterns. For centuries, the Indus cities had relied on seasonal rains to flood their rivers and nourish the soil. But as the monsoons weakened and became less predictable, that system began to fail. The once dependable rivers started to dry. Wells, once central to urban life, dropped lower each year. Canals and reservoirs could no longer keep pace with the needs of growing populations. Archaeological and geological evidence points to a long-term drought possibly lasting several centuries. As rainfall declined, agriculture became harder to sustain. Fields that once supported surplus farming yielded less and less. Without water, urban life grew more difficult. Food shortages may have increased. Trade dependent on agricultural surplus likely declined as well. This environmental pressure didn't just affect one city. It impacted the entire region from Harappa in the north to Dholavira in the south. Many settlements were built along rivers like the Hakra, which may have once flowed year-round. By this period, it had started to dry up, leaving towns without the lifeline they depended on. The changing climate didn't destroy the Indus civilization overnight, but it may have made its great cities increasingly unsustainable, pushing people to adapt, relocate, or abandon urban life altogether. As rainfall declined, another force quietly reshaped the Indus landscape: the rivers themselves. The Indus civilization had grown alongside powerful water systems. But over time, some of those rivers began to shift or disappear. One of the most important was the Hakra River, a river many scholars believe may be the long-lost Sarasvati. Mentioned in ancient texts, archaeological surveys show that dozens of Indus settlements were built along its banks. These communities depended entirely on its waters for drinking, farming, and trade. But as the climate changed, the Hakra gradually dried up. Its once strong flow weakened into seasonal trickles. Eventually, it vanished in some stretches, leaving behind only dry beds of silt and sand. This was not just a change in geography, it was a disruption to daily life. Irrigation systems failed, crops withered, trade routes were cut off. Entire towns, once thriving, were suddenly stranded, with no water and no way to adapt. As the rivers changed their course or disappeared entirely, settlements were abandoned. Satellite imagery and geological studies confirm this pattern, a clear alignment between river shifts and the locations of deserted Indus towns. Some people likely tried to relocate. Others may have moved eastward, toward more stable water sources like the Ganges. The shifting rivers, once the lifeblood of the Indus world, had become unpredictable, even dangerous. And with their disappearance, so too, faded many of the cities built along their banks. As water sources failed and cities emptied, the economic system that had once sustained the Indus civilization also began to break down. For centuries, the Indus Valley had maintained long-distance trade routes reaching Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Goods like cotton, textiles, beads, carnelian, and metalwork moved across deserts and seas. But now, those networks began to fray. With rivers drying up and ports becoming less active, trade slowed and in some areas may have collapsed entirely. Imports and exports diminished, foreign goods became scarce, and merchants lost their links to distant markets. At the same time, signs of internal instability began to appear. The uniform system of standardized weights, once used for fair trade, declined. Later weights are irregular, scattered, and often locally made. Craftsmanship also suffered. Workshops that had once produced intricate beads, painted pottery, and expertly carved seals grew inconsistent. Some shut down altogether. This wasn't just about trade, it was about identity. The economic order of the Indus Valley had depended on shared standards and specialization. When those broke down, so did the cohesion of urban life. Without reliable trade, cities could no longer support large populations or highly specialized labor. Potters, metal workers, traders all struggled as demand dropped and surplus disappeared. The cities didn't just lose people, they lost purpose. And with that, a major pillar of the civilization's success began to crumble from within. As the Indus civilization entered its final centuries, the cities themselves began to change, and not for the better. The carefully planned layouts that had once defined Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and Dholavira started to break down. Straight streets became irregular. New homes were built directly on top of older ones, without alignment or coordination. In many areas, once orderly neighborhoods turned into crowded clusters of makeshift structures. The change wasn't just in design, it was in function. Public infrastructure, one of the civilization's great achievements, began to deteriorate. Drainage systems, which had once carried wastewater beneath every street, were left clogged and unrepaired. Wells ran dry, and some public bathing areas were abandoned altogether. Even the symbols of shared culture began to vanish. The iconic steatite seals, once used in trade and administration, became fewer and less detailed. Inscriptions in the Indus script nearly disappeared. It's clear that something deeper was unraveling. The systems that held the cities together, planning, sanitation, governance, and communication, were breaking down piece by piece. This was not a simple matter of buildings crumbling with age. It was a shift in how the cities functioned and in how people lived within them. By the end, many of the great urban centers of the Indus no longer resembled the marvels they once were. They were still cities in name, but the civilization that had created them was already fading away. As the great cities of the Indus began to fade, their people did not vanish. Instead, they moved. Archaeological evidence suggests that many communities gradually migrated eastward, away from the drying rivers and failing infrastructure, toward more stable water sources in the Ganges plain. Others left the cities behind and settled in smaller, rural villages. Some moved into the foothills and highlands, adapting to new environments. These were not mass evacuations, but slow, generational shifts. Family by family, people dispersed, seeking farmland, water, or simply a place to begin again. And in doing so, they didn't abandon everything. They carried with them elements of Indus life: pottery styles, bead-making traditions, farming knowledge, and religious symbols. Over time, these traditions merged with local cultures to form something new. In eastern Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh, later settlements show clear echoes of Indus craftsmanship and organization. Even without cities or writing, the cultural memory endured. This phase, sometimes called the late Harappan period, was not a rebirth, but a transformation. It marked the end of one way of life and the beginning of many others. The Indus people did not disappear. They dispersed into the hills, the plains, and the future, leaving behind not a ruin, but a legacy, reshaped by time and distance. Many ancient civilizations fell through conquest brought down by invading armies, burning cities, and violent upheaval. But the Indus Valley tells a different story. Across dozens of sites from Mohenjo-daro to Harappa, archaeologists have found almost no signs of warfare. Weapons are rare. Mass graves, fortifications, and battle damage are virtually non-existent. The great cities were not destroyed by fire. They were not overrun by foreign armies. They were left behind. Walls crumbled, not from siege, but from neglect. Drainage systems failed, not from sabotage, but from disuse. People moved not as refugees, but as migrants seeking new places to live. Even skeletons recovered from Indus sites show little evidence of violent trauma. The fall of this civilization appears to have been slow, quiet, and systemic, shaped by environmental change, economic strain, and gradual depopulation. Some scholars once theorized an invasion by Indo-Aryan peoples, but no archaeological record supports that view. Instead, the evidence points to internal decline, a complex, multi-layered process that unfolded over generations. In this way, the Indus Valley's collapse is unique. It was not a battlefield ending. It was a fading, like a candle going out slowly, rather than being snuffed out by force. And perhaps that quiet ending tells us something deeper about the kind of civilization they had been all along. The last chapter of the Indus Valley Civilization unfolded quietly. There was no single collapse, no final battle, just a gradual loss of what had once connected it all. One of the most telling signs was the disappearance of writing. The Indus script, found for centuries on seals, tablets, and pottery, vanished from the archaeological record. There are no bilingual texts, no long inscriptions, and now, no new examples after 1300 BCE without writing. A civilization loses part of its voice, its ability to remember, record, and organize across distances. At the same time, the cultural unity that once stretched across 1,000 kilometers began to break apart. The shared bricks, seals, and weights gave way to regional variation. Local styles and traditions replaced a once standard system. By 1300 BCE, the great cities were no longer cities. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira all either abandoned or transformed into smaller rural communities. Their infrastructure crumbled, their institutions faded, and the Indus civilization, once one of the largest in the ancient world, slipped into history. But even in its ending, it left a legacy. Pottery designs, farming practices, and cultural symbols lived on not in cities, but in scattered villages. The script was lost, but not everything was forgotten. In place of a single civilization, a mosaic of cultures emerged, each carrying fragments of what came before. This was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of something new. For more than 3,000 years, the cities of the Indus lay buried beneath layers of earth and time, forgotten, unmarked, and unnamed. No legends told of their builders, no ancient texts described their streets then. In the 1920s, everything changed. Railway engineers in British India stumbled upon mysterious bricks while laying tracks near the town of Harappa. What they had unknowingly uncovered was not just a mound, but the remains of one of the world's oldest urban civilizations. And after excavations began at Mohenjo-daro, what archaeologists found stunned the world. Broad streets laid out in perfect grids, advanced drainage systems, multi-story brick homes, all dating back more than 4,000 years. These weren't the scattered ruins of a forgotten tribe. They were the planned cities of a sophisticated Bronze Age people. Over the following decades, thousands of artifacts were unearthed: pottery, jewelry, seals, tools, and terracotta figurines. Each discovery added new pieces to a puzzle no one had known existed. But perhaps the most mysterious find was the Indus script. Hundreds of inscriptions carved into stone, still undeciphered to this day. Rediscovery of the Indus Valley Civilization rewrote the history of South Asia. It revealed that long before the rise of Vedic culture or empires, a powerful, peaceful, and deeply urban society had once flourished here and then disappeared. And even now, a century later, its full story remains only partly told. A century after their rediscovery, the ancient cities of the Indus still stand, but they face new challenges. Today, major Indus Valley sites like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Dholavira, recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. This status reflects their global importance, not just to South Asia, but to the shared story of human civilization. Mohenjo-daro was declared a UNESCO site in 1980. Dholavira followed in 2021. These cities now draw researchers, students, and visitors from around the world. But with that recognition comes responsibility. Preserving ruins that are over 4,000 years old is no easy task. At Mohenjo-daro, the ancient bricks face intense heat, groundwater erosion, and seasonal flooding. Entire walls have collapsed after heavy rains. At Dholavira, saltwater intrusion from nearby marshlands threatens foundations. Harappa contends with modern encroachment, buildings, roads, and agriculture pressing in on the site's edges. Despite these challenges, preservation efforts continue. South Asian archaeologists and conservators work year-round, reinforcing walls, documenting layouts, and managing visitor access. Local communities are also engaged, learning the importance of protecting the past. Modern technology, from satellite mapping to 3D modeling, now helps monitor the health of these ancient cities. But time, weather, and human activity remain constant pressures the Indus cities endured for centuries. Whether they survive the next 100 years will depend not on ancient engineers, but on us. Although the Indus Valley Civilization came to an end, its influence did not across South Asia. Traces of its legacy continued to shape the cultures that followed. Agricultural techniques, including irrigation, flood control, and crop rotation, likely informed later farming practices in the Ganges plain and beyond. Crops first cultivated in the Indus, like cotton and barley, remained central to South Asian life for thousands of years. The Indus cities had pioneered brick construction, and that tradition survived. Later towns and temples across the subcontinent still used sun-dried and kiln-fired bricks, often following similar proportions. Trade systems also endured long after the fall of Mohenjo-daro. Regional commerce in beads, textiles, and metals continued to link distant parts of the Indian subcontinent. Even standard weights and stone seals appear to have influenced later trade customs. But perhaps the most lasting legacies were cultural and symbolic religious motifs seen on Indus seals, like the pipal tree horned animals and meditative figures, have parallels in later Vedic and Hindu traditions. Some scholars suggest continuity in fertility symbols, ritual bathing, and the early use of sacred fire. The Indus script may be undeciphered, but its cultural imprint remains. South Asia's rich spiritual and artistic traditions did not begin from nothing. They grew from deep roots, some of which were planted in the brick-lined streets of the Indus, and though names changed, the memory lived on, not in writing, but in practice, belief, and design. For all that we've learned about the Indus Valley Civilization, so much still remains unknown. At the heart of the mystery lies their script found on seals, pottery, tablets, and tools. The Indus script includes over 400 unique symbols, but without a bilingual inscription like a Rosetta Stone, it has never been deciphered. We don't know how it sounded, we don't know what it said, and until we do, key questions remain unanswered. We still don't know the name they called themselves, or how they organized their society. We have no confirmed records of kings' armies or laws, no clear evidence of temples or religious texts. What we do know is this: the Indus cities were unlike their ancient peers. They left behind no palaces, no empires, and no monuments to conquest, and yet they built one of the largest, most advanced urban cultures of the ancient world. Their planning, engineering, and peaceful design challenge everything we assume about early civilizations. Some scholars suggest a form of decentralized governance. Others see signs of a spiritual culture deeply tied to nature, fertility, and water. But without text to guide us, we're left with possibilities, not certainty. In the end, the Indus Valley remains one of history's great enigmas. What they believed, how they ruled, even what language they spoke, these are mysteries still waiting beneath the dust, and perhaps still waiting to be heard. Though the Indus Valley Civilization vanished thousands of years ago, its technological innovations continued to shape the world. Among their most remarkable achievements was the development of standardized weights and measures across vast distances. From Harappa, two lawful merchants used nearly identical stone weights, a level of economic coordination unmatched by most ancient cultures. This allowed for fair trade, tax collection, and storage systems that depended on trust and precision. Their cities also set a global precedent in urban infrastructure. The people of the Indus designed advanced drainage systems, covered street drains, soak pits, and private bathrooms connected to public sewers built more than 4,000 years ago. These systems weren't for the elite, they were used by everyone. It was urban sanitation on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until Rome, or even modern times. They were also pioneers in cotton textiles, the earliest evidence of cotton cultivation and weaving. Commies from the Indus region dating as far back as 2500 BCE. Indus cotton may have traveled through trade routes, eventually reaching Mesopotamia, Egypt, and far beyond. These weren't scattered experiments, they were systemic technologies planned, shared, and sustained. From uniform bricks and plant cities to scales, sewers, and cloth, the Indus legacy is one of engineering and design. They may have left no pyramids or written laws, but they gave the world something just as lasting: the blueprint for civilization built on balance, cleanliness, and practical genius. When the Indus Valley Civilization was uncovered in the 1920s, it didn't just rewrite the history of South Asia, it reshaped the global story of civilization. Until then, the ancient world was framed around Egypt and Mesopotamia as if complex society had only emerged in the West, but the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro changed that. They revealed that as early as 2600 BCE, a vast organized and urban culture had flourished in the Indian subcontinent with its own architecture, economy, and systems, and no borrowed blueprint. This discovery forced scholars to reconsider what it meant to be a cradle of civilization. India was not a distant follower, it was a parallel origin. Since then, the Indus has become a vital subject of academic study around the world. From university classrooms to excavation trenches, researchers continue to piece together the civilization's mysteries, its cities, its script, its people. Sites like Rakagari and Ganrawala still being excavated, new technologies, satellite imaging, isotope analysis, ancient DNA, pushing the field into new territory. Each discovery shifts the timeline, each artifact reshapes the narrative. The Indus Valley didn't just leave behind bricks and seals, it left behind questions that continue to challenge the boundaries of what we thought we knew, and in doing so, it hasn't only expanded our past, it has expanded the very way we study it. The Indus Valley Civilization stands today as more than just an archaeological discovery. It is a symbol of what indigenous culture can achieve without conquest, without empire, without borrowed blueprints. Here was a civilization that rose from the soil of South Asia, built by the hands of its own people. Its cities were not forged by war, but by civic planning, by community, by vision. For centuries, colonial narratives portrayed the East as technologically dependent, a land where progress came from outside, not from within. But the bricks of Mohenjo-daro and the drains of Harappa told a different story. They spoke of local ingenuity, measured, elegant, and far ahead of its time. The Indus script remains unread, and yet its silence challenges more than just historians. It challenges the idea that greatness must come with kings or conquest. The Indus people created complex systems of trade, sanitation, and standardization, not to glorify a ruler, but to serve daily life, and that is perhaps their most powerful legacy. Not only what they built, but how today the Indus stands as a reminder that some of humanity's most remarkable achievements can emerge not through domination, but through balance, cooperation, and quiet innovation. Thousands of years may separate us from the Indus Valley Civilization, but its presence has never truly disappeared. Today, its legacy continues to inspire urban planners, historians, architects, and artists. Its brickwork, water systems, and city layouts are studied in universities across the world, not just as relics of the past, but as blueprints for sustainable urban living. In South Asia, the influence runs even deeper. Motifs from Indus seals appear in art, textiles, and architecture. Modern infrastructure projects in India and Pakistan sometimes reference Indus water management principles, and in classrooms from Karachi to Kolkata, students learn that long before the rise of empires, their ancestors built cities based on balance, cooperation, and order. The Indus script remains undeciphered, but the civilization's symbols have become part of national heritage. They appear in museum logos, postage stamps, and even currency. For many, the Indus is more than a historical site. It is a source of pride, a reminder that South Asia's story begins not with conquest, but with creativity, trade, and civic life. It also remains a mystery, a civilization still half in shadow, inviting new generations to explore, interpret, and imagine. In a time of rapid growth and change, the Indus reminds us of what's possible when cities are built not for kings but for people.